Hi all, we're going to do a Ferret wheel station disassembly to tighten up the wheel bearings today. So this vehicle's got three wheels that are slightly looser than I would like, which you can tell from just that amount of movement is the limit that I'm willing to drive with, and that's roughly 500 miles worth of driving on and off road. And apparently the Australian Army would strip these every 500 miles and retighten them, so I've just used that as a go-to. Left hand side is left hand threads. So don't do what I did the very first time I tried to take the wheel off, bent the bar, because I didn't realise. Last wheel nut, so it's already jacked up with an axle stand under this wheel. Meant to do that. The wheels are relatively light. Once you've got the wheel off, we're going to take this over, all these cap heads out, and this is going to drop all the oil out of this hub. If you have it in the right place to start with, you can just use the drain, but as this knocks off, all the oil will come out as well. Okay, now make sure you're kneeling on something comfortable. You're going to be on the ground for a long period of time. 7:30 seconds. Allen key, in gentle, tap tap tap, come and done. Wind out the cap heads. The first of many. So I previously marked the inner and outer part, so we can just go back in the same place. There's no gasket between these two faces, and I've never had it leak. Just put good sealant on there, and it's always been fine. So we'll pop this, and the oil should drain out. A bit like that. So I'm running all my hubs with semi-fluid grease oil mix in them, and that's always worked well for me. That's what I like to see. Let it all drain in there. Cleaning it all later. That will continue to drain for quite a while, but this is the carrier. I'm taking it off, so the outer carrier first, and then you're releasing all the split pins, nuts, and pulling this inner bearing will come off as well. And then we'll finally get down to the gears underneath. So on this centre shaft we've got a tab washer which is locked over, so you just need to knock the tab back out of the way. And all these 1/2 inch bolts around the outside, just release them. They'll all be torqued back up at the end. Each one has a spring washer underneath it, so we'll take them all out, and we'll release that nut in the middle, and then the outer part will come off. Okay, so we loosen the nut, take it off, take the tab washer off, into a bucket of parts, and you get this outer carrier off to pull the gear off the bearing off the shaft. Just reuse 2 of your cap heads. It's got pre-made pulling piece on it. ease that off. Should come pretty easily. Yeah, there we go. The fun part's putting it back on. Okay, so we've jacked that off. Comes off nice and clean. Don't lose the shims behind it. So it sets the preload. So again, put it all somewhere safe and clean. Make sure you get all the shims off there. To go back. And then, this being equal, you should be able to get that off, but it's just the oil's holding it, so it'll just slide off that shaft. If you ever had to disable the wheel station, you would go this far and just take that center gear out, and then it won't drive from the bevel box anymore. Okay, we'll remove the split pins from each of these nuts. We're not going to reuse them. New one's back. Automatically destroyed on the way out. Okay. Then 916. So right tool, and you can pull that gear out of the center. This can only go one way because of the spacer. That spacer will come off. So just make sure it's either marked or set so you know which way it goes back. Nut and flat washer on each of these. That's all going to get washed later. So with that center gear out, you can see the Planetary gears driving around in there, which is all pretty cool. And we'll check all of those and the bearings when we get them out. Okay, we need to take this inner retainer out, and it's got our favourite cap head jacking system. So, same thing, just gently bring the pressure on all three. And it should pull away. So you just jack that off with the three cap heads evenly. It should just pop off in the end. Don't let it fall on the oil like I just did. And note on the back of where each of these run is the part of the bearing for the needle bearings systems. So I like to keep them the way they came off. So once again, we'll clean that and set it aside, ready for assembly. Okay, so we're down to the Planetary gears, and each one of these has the many needle bearings in, which we're going to count and make sure we put the right ones back. So, things being equal, that should come off. Take the oil tray away, otherwise all the needle bearings will drop in the tray. And if you can, it's great to get them out. Still in the gear, like that. And same thing, I always match the gear the way it came off. I put it back the same way. The needle bearings I'm not so fussy about. It's got to be inspected and cleaned in any case. So you just go around and do each of those. Okay, so this is the Planetary gear carrier, which holds the tension onto the wheel bearing. And this is what we're down to change. These bolts stretch. It was a design failure from the beginning. They originally had cap head bolts in there for the English Ferrets. The Australian Army changed them to just hex bolts. They just came to the conclusion that the sheer amount of load on the wheel meant that they're just always going to stretch, and they had to be taken out, retightened, replaced. So each of these has a locking tab on it, so you knock that back out of the way, gentle, and then just take each of these out, and then we'll just take the Planetary carrier off, and we're down to the shims on the other side. Okay, we remove all the bolts and locking tabs. I throw the bolts away, up to you. I'm going to reuse them. I'm just always worried that they've already stretched once and I'm not interested in having one break off in there. All being equal, carrier should come off the dowels. A bit of wiggling. This is already marked, so it's okay. And on the back are the shims, and the shims are what adjust the wheel bearing tension. So you want to get them off and make sure they're all intact, and that's what we'll be using to adjust the bearing tension. And you can just see the wheel bearing, the back of the wheel bearing there. So that carrier and those shims press against that wheel bearing. Okay, you can see these dowels all the way around here. If this gets too loose for too long, the carrier starts to move on the dowels and wears both the carrier and the dowels. When I redid this the first time, I had dowels remachined, and every time I take it apart, you always check that they haven't moved and they are back hard into the carrier and they're not showing any signs of damage, and they are all in place. Okay, so we've got this out and we've degreased and cleaned all that, and we made sure it all looks very nice and there's no metal missing and no metal in there, and it's perfect. Got our shim pack, that's the brass and one steel shim. So I just tried the brass one on there and tightened it up, and it was tight. So I'm just going to try the brass with one steel shim and we'll see if that's the adjustment we want. So the shims were like 2 or 3 different sizes. And so I'm just going to shim it around this, just the one at the moment, see what it does. And this bit will go back on. A bit like that. Okay, so we've put it back in there with the right amount of shims, we believe. Feels firm but not overly tight. I'm pretty happy with that. Can't hear or feel any bearing movement. Tighten it down progressively up to 35 foot-pound. So there's a grade 8 bolts, which are technically good for 43 foot-pound at 65% yield. I'm not real comfortable with making it that tight, but 35 is pretty good, I think. And now we'll begin reassembly. With the bolts tightened down, we make sure we go back through and lock the locking tabs back over onto each bolt head. If the tab's broken or damaged, manufacture a new locking washer. Okay, last of the Planetary gears going back in. Clean and check as they go. Grease the back and the inside. Back into there, and then 24 needle bearings per gear. Okay, so put the inserts in that go there, hold the needle bearings in, and there's another one of those that was on the inside, which we never took off, and then we grease the back of that just because we can. And then we put it back, and all things being equal, goes on good. Okay, on the left front, stripped down, took the shims out, tightened the bolts back in, and it's tighter than you definitely want. Like you can feel it, she's tight on the bearing. So we'll take that apart now, shim it till we're back happy again. So this is the front left reassembly. Planetary gears, needle bearings are all back in. There's grease inside each of these. I always grease the backing plate just because I can, so it's not running dry. Pop mark to the top. Set it into position, and it will sit there. And then we have to put the washers back on and the nuts to actually jack it back into position, to pull it back into position. Okay, so this is on, just make sure it seats up neatly, and then you can either gently knock it on with a hammer or just pull it down with the bolts. I prefer to pull it down with the bolts, doesn't take much time. Just do it around the circuit. So one trick when putting these back together, you've got to make it line up with the slots in the nut, and they didn't put the holes through the pin in the same position. Some are up, some are at 90 degrees, some are all over the place, so After you pulled it all in, take the nuts back off, clean the holes out, and then assemble. They don't have to be blindingly tight. Tight is good. And the pin should just neatly go through. A bit like that. So I think I noted at the start that this is a metal to metal face and there's no gasket in it. I just use a good quality sealant, just a very little amount. I've never had any problems. It goes without saying that you've got a scraper, and when we had this all apart, we cleaned it all off till we were happy. And then the same for this side as well. And degreaser of your choice. Clean everything before you put it back. You went to all this effort, so you don't want it to leak, you don't want any contamination in there, and it should be good for another 500 miles. Okay, one other thing which I missed the first few times around, so you got a drain plug on here which you normally use to fill and drain the oil. If you want them all to be in the same position, you should set it so that it is going back in the same position, so the dowels key into there. In this case, the plug is just about vertically down on all the wheels. Just makes it a lot easier to service it. Alright. Spacer goes back in. You can see the way it goes because it's got the marks of the gear it runs up against. Gear, once again. And you're inspecting all of these as you go as well to make sure there's no metal missing or anything else. They're all lovely and perfect. Now you just get it to mesh back into the Planetary, a bit like that. Add your shim pack back. Okay, and this is just holding this adjustable shaft anyway, so when we put the last piece on it, it sets that distance and keeps it just nice and squared up. Alright, I always find this piece really interesting to put back. So we've got this shaft with the big gear on it, and this end float is set by this piece once it's pulled in. That's a bearing in the middle there, and that's a machine face, and they're a bit of an interference fit, which you think would be fine, except the shaft moves backwards. The only easy way I've found to do this, and maybe someone else can tell me a better way, is to initially tap that on there evenly. So you tap that down evenly till it's all the way on. Just using the right size socket so it doesn't touch the shaft, it just goes around the outside of the bearing. Then the part I'm sure nobody likes watching is using the nut to jack it on. So we still need to pull the shaft through till it binds up against the bearing. Leave the washer off for the moment. And today I don't happen to have the right size socket, so I will use a different technique known as the adjustable spanner. I just pull it down till it starts to load up onto the outer bit, and then just gently tap it and just you can see that it's loose again, and that's just pulling that shaft through. And yes, it's a little bit slow going, but you don't want to damage anything, so take your time, and eventually once I've got a full nut through, or full nut so the shaft's all the way through, then you can put a bit more weight onto it and just draw it all the way through. Then take it off again and put the locking tab washer on. Okay, so the shaft's pulled all the way through, put the locking tab washer on there, And yes, when I'm doing this I have heaps of grease on there to try and save the nut, and I've got to say, you know, even after 10 years and doing this several times now, I'm still on the same nut, and I've always just been taking my time and just being careful with it. So obviously the shaft is very hard and the nut is not as hard. So once the nut's back on and we're happy, punch the locking tab up against it so it can't come undone. Each of these bolts back in, 15-pound feet. You know. So. And I think that's all of them. Okay, final reassembly. We've cleaned and degreased this face. All the split pins are in, everything's locked. Tab washer's locked over onto this nut. Cleaned this, we've cleaned the other face. The very thinnest spread of your sealant of choice, because it is a machined surface, so it doesn't really need anything too much in there at all. And then we line the dowels up, put it back. Oh, and no sealant on the dowels, just so it doesn't hydraulically lock up when it goes in. That's nice and solid down all the way around. Put your cap heads back in, and they don't have to be blind tight, just got to be tight. That's it. And that is the end of wheel hub strip and reassembly.